welcome to everybody on the call today. We have a very large room full of people from across the world. So welcome from wherever you're at. And I'm excited for you to join us for this next hour about differential diagnosis in dyslexia. I'm super excited to have one of my colleagues here at Pearson, Dr. Christina Bro, to join me today to be able to discuss some of the research that she's conducted around this topic. And I think this is a very timely issue for us all to discuss. So thanks for coming. First things first, for those of you who are psychologists or school psychologists, we are offering APA or NASP credits if you attend the live session. This might be recorded and put on our website, but for attending the live session, we are offering CEs for APA and NASP. This is information about the APA certificates. This incorrectly says 90 minutes. This will be a 60-minute presentation, but this will give you information on how to do that. Additionally, I think the best way for me to let everybody know if you're listening to the live presentation, just go to pearsonclinical.com and search for the title of this webinar session, and you'll find a page on Pearson's website that gives the instructions for getting those certificates. So happy learning to everybody and welcome. I talked about this as, unfolding origami because for those of us who have been engaged in the diagnostic sphere for some time, we know that oftentimes disability determination can be very complex, and we have to be able to look at a child's picture or a picture of a student and really unravel the entire picture so that we can get to the bottom. Another way to think about it is peeling the layers of an onion. I've heard it talked about that way as well. And quite frankly, the other reason why I talked about it as unfolding origami is because I took my family to Morimoto's restaurant the other day, and on the children's menu, there's instructions for folding origami, which I found very, very difficult. So that was fresh in my mind. These are some financial disclosures. Both Christina and I are employees of Pearson. We are going to be talking about some research and possibly some products that are Pearson's, although that is not the focus of our session today, but we may mention those in passing. In addition, Christina is the author of the KT3 and YAT3 assessment book, so she is also disclosing those financial royalties. This is our agenda for the day. We have quite a packed session, so I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible. We are going to leave some time for a case study at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all of this with little hiccups. You did all receive a handout earlier today. It was emailed out as a reminder email, so it would have come from our host today, Sherry Locken, and it would have said that there were handouts on the right side as a downloadable file. So please check your email if you didn't receive those, but everybody that is on this call today did receive that email earlier today. Here are our learner outcomes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we will review them at the end of the day, but keep these in mind because they are important for you if you are seeking CEs from either NASP or APA. So this is where we're going to start. That was a quick introduction. Just wanted to get through all of the logistics first. The way that I like to think about dyslexia and starting to think about assessment is to form a framework. And oftentimes the framework that we develop has to start with typical. I always like to think about, with regard to reading or any learning disability, what is it that we expect for the development of typical reading or typical learning, and then we are able to find what is atypical from that. So this is just the way that I like to start out thinking here. And essentially, the important thing to frame ourselves with is the fact that reading is language. So we first have to consider what is the developmental acquisition of language. And essentially, and I know that this is a very high-level discussion or high-level way to explain this, but it does give us a frame of reference. We tend to develop phonological skills before orthographic skills as a child. So it's not uncommon, or it is expected for us to develop receptive oral language, which is language by ear, before we develop expressive oral language, which is language by mouth. And then after we develop those two, we tend to develop the receptive component of written language before the expressive component of written language. So as we develop in time, whenever you talk about reading disorders or dyslexia specifically, you always hear researchers talking about how children with language delays are at higher risk for dyslexia. And this is exactly the reason why, because developmentally, if the phonological skills aren't developed efficiently enough to begin with, the orthographic skills or orthographic skill development will suffer as well. Additionally, if we think about at a high level just what it is that reading looks like at different grades, it's important for us to remember that reading develops before reading actually occurs. So there are pre-reader development skills that we see in pre-K and before pre-K, depending on the level of enrichment a student receives, such as letter ID, rhyming, IDing letters, phonemes, and spoken words. Then we look at letter and sound correspondence, slowly developing sight word vocabulary, although that does oftentimes correspond with letter sound correspondence. And a lot of times in schools we see that sight word development occurring earlier and earlier because in our education system there is a big push to develop sight words early on. And that's fine, but that does occur sometimes earlier than we expect. Additionally, we move on to decoding, which requires accuracy and fluency. If you think about fluency, it's the ability to do it quickly and accurately. So that develops over time, starting in first grade, but really not coming to fruition until later, second and then third grade. And as we go along, you can see, decoding and how that becomes more complex, and then reading for comprehension really coming at about the fourth grade level. And these are the things that we expect children to develop. So when they don't, it starts to get us, considering what's going on. Just very quickly, as an overview of the neurobiology of reading, we'll get into the discussion of dyslexia in a second and what that means. But neurobiology is very important for us to remember and recognize. Reading is not just one area of the brain. It does not occur in let's say, the parieto-temporal region. It does not occur in the occipitotemporal region because we're just seeing letters. It's actually a pathway. The pathway is an efficient process that occurs between these three areas in the brain. You can see the yellow corresponds to the inferior frontal gyrus, which is responsible for vocalization and articulation. The red star corresponds to the parieto-temporal region, which corresponds to or is responsible for word analysis. And the green star is the occipitotemporal region, which corresponds to word recognition and automaticity. So it's important for us to remember that efficient reading requires all three of those areas to be communicating with each other in an efficient manner. Now, with that in mind, let's think about what dyslexia is specifically. So I go back to the definition that's provided by the International Dyslexia Association in 2002, and also you see that in some recent legislation like the Cassidy-Mikulski resolution in 2015. The important thing to start with is that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. That kind of goes back to that one slide number that I showed you what the pathway was. We can absolutely see the difference in the brain of a student with dyslexia versus those without. It is also unexpected, so we expect them to have better reading based on their ability levels. It's language-based. That's something that we cannot forget. Reading is language. We'll go back to that. And then I have some of the characteristics here, like accurate and or fluent word recognition difficulties, poor spelling and decoding abilities. We have some secondary consequences listed here, such as problems with comprehension and reading experience. Of course, if they're not reading, then we know that the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge suffers, and also that it is typically the result of deficits in the phonological component of the language. Okay, it's often, but not always, present with an uneven cognitive profile. I mean, there is a specific profile that we look for, but it is also important for us to remember that that doesn't always occur. Oh, sorry about that. That slide was not supposed to be there. Let me just pass by that. I was wondering where that slide went. I put a question in and it disappeared on me, but I must have put it in the wrong spot, so I apologize for that. And then really what I want to show is the reason why we know it's a neurobiological condition. And this is, there's a lot of research coming out of the Yale Child Study Center by a clinician known as Sally Shaywitz that shows the neural pathway for students and people with dyslexia. On the left is the non-impaired brain, and that's a reflection of what we saw in the previous slide that I talked about. And on the right, we see what would be considered the patterns in a dyslexic brain. And effectively, that shows the inefficient pathways or inefficient communication between regions of the brain in students and people with dyslexia. So with that in mind, and I just wanted to give that real quick overview, it's important for us when we're considering differential diagnosis to first understand what it is that we are assessing for and how we look at a specific condition, and then how we rule in or rule out other factors, right? So this is an important place for us to start. I always like to think about it as symptoms, causes, and correlates and risk factors with learning conditions. With dyslexia specifically, I will show you how that applies. And first I want to start with the idea of incremental variance. And really what I'm talking about here is the fact that we start with some level of information that points us in a specific path or points us to a specific outcome. So let's say we have red there, which is poor performance on a curriculum-based measurement. That gives us some information about whether or not or what it is specifically that this child is having difficulty with. Let's say that we find out that this child also has below average working memory. Well, that also adds to the variance. It also adds to our overall understanding. And then we find out more that they have below average rapid automatic naming, difficulty with spelling, etc. That gives us the full picture of what dyslexia would be in that student. So it's important that we don't just find little bits of information. It's really building upon one another to find whether or not dyslexia occurs. And I like to think about it based on, again, the symptoms, causes, and correlates and risk factors. And I think the best way for me to compare this is, when a child sneezes or when they have a stuffy nose, that's a symptom of another issue, right? So I just happened to take my daughter to the doctor today. She's had a cold for the past couple of days and had some sneezing and a fever. And it's interesting because if I were just to say that sneezing, she had a cold and a fever, would I automatically say that was the flu? Or if I had runny eyes, would I say that I had pink eye? No, I wouldn't. What you have to do at this point is to look more in detail at what is causing those symptoms. So it's important for us to look at not only response to intervention or effective instruction, because dyslexia occurs in light of effective instruction or in light of treatment. Also at the symptoms, such as at the pre-reader level, we can see alphabet writing and phonics and letter knowledge difficulties. At the reader level, we start seeing word reading and decoding difficulties, fluency, spelling, written expression difficulties, and we tend to see reading comprehension is less than their listening comprehension, and that makes sense, right, when you think about it. The causes and or correlates of those symptoms can be this list that's up here, and most of the time it's super important that we look at phonological processing, rapid automatic naming, and auditory working memory. Those three specifically are called out by many organizations, including the International Dyslexia Association, as being important or necessary for a dyslexia evaluation. Processing speed, long-term storage and retrieval, associative memory, orthographic processing are some others. And then also in light of risk factors. So it's important that we think about family history and language impairment, whether or not they have poor receptive vocabulary, but also scores that we find in the school system about screening. So if we have dyslexia or reading screening, so let's say we have a universal screener that shows that reading is a weakness, that's a risk factor. If we give a very specific example, a very specific screening measure such as the Shaywitz, and that shows that they're at risk, then that is a risk factor. So it's important that we consider all of those in conjunction with one another. And as well, it would be bad practice, not best practice, if we didn't look at strengths. And again, I can't stress enough how important it is that we consider strength profiles when we're doing a differential diagnosis. And the reason is because we want to understand where those possible strengths occur and how they would either confirm or refute other hypotheses. So possible strengths in fluid reasoning and or problem solving, oral language, which is something that oftentimes we may not think is the truth, but we find that in people with dyslexia, listening, speaking, vocabulary, and grammar can be a possible strength. And math, we see those as possible strengths as well. And again, not only for differential diagnosis, but if I go back to thinking about intervention strategies we should always form interventions and strategies based on those cognitive processing strengths. You heard me mention earlier the key indicators for dyslexia, and I'll give a nod here to IDA and also a colleague out, and I believe she's in Washington, Virginia Berninger, talking about some of the symptoms and causes and correlates and risk factors. And those that I have listed up here on the screen are important and almost, I would dare to say, necessary in every dyslexia evaluation. So when we think about the symptoms, we have to determine letter knowledge and phonics, decoding pseudo words, word reading, fluency, spelling. That spelling notation there is important because oftentimes researchers will talk about that it is the most persistent impairment in individuals with dyslexia. And then also written language. Also then going into detail for thinking about causes for the phonological processing, phonological awareness, and phonological coding. Rapid automatic naming, as well as auditory verbal working memory. And then also receptive vocabulary and family history there is important as well. But why is this whole idea so difficult? Why is it so challenging for us within the dyslexia assessment space? I think that's why you're all here, because it is not an easy answer. It is very challenging. And these 6 points I have up here on the screen are important for us to process. One is that comorbidity is the norm in this space and is not the exception. Misdiagnosis is very, very common because there are very similar symptoms across a number of disorders, specifically learning disorders, but also across learning disorders and behavioral or emotional conditions as well. There are false negatives that are common. There's a failure to identify it, particularly within screening measures. We can think about how classification systems are unreliable or inconsistent, and the easiest way for us to identify that is to look at the DSM and the medical community diagnostic system for learning disorders and the IDEA or school system special education diagnostic system classification system for learning disorders. So they're very inconsistent. Also, there's a lot of heterogeneity in what dyslexia looks like, and Christina will get into that more in a minute. Also, learning histories and profiles are very complex and unusual, so it's hard for us to really figure those out and to pull those out specifically. So that's why this is so challenging, and we have some suggestions for you how to make it easier. Number one is really to think about selecting diagnostic assessments that are both psychometrically and theoretically supported. So are we looking at tests for reading versus tests for dyslexia? It's very important that we think about both of those things, that we not only have theoretical support in the measure, but we also have psychometric support in the standardization sample and how it was developed. Additionally, it's important that we think about diagnostic assessments that include the components that I talked about earlier. So not only the strengths, not only whether or not response to treatment or instruction is accounted for, but also the areas of potential weakness, and that would be across symptoms, the correlates, and the risk factors. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Bro, and she's going to work on some of the key theoretical frameworks.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. In this next section, I'll share with you 4 theoretical frameworks that are grounded in strong research and are really foundational for classifying dyslexia and differentiating it from other conditions. And you may find that you align more closely to one versus another, but they're not necessarily either or. I think it can be really helpful to keep multiple frameworks in mind throughout the assessment process. So I'll go through these in a mostly chronological order. So the first model is a single deficit model of dyslexia. So essentially, a deficit in phonological processing is necessary and sufficient to cause dyslexia. So this model is still very relevant today, and there are certainly leading experts and many practitioners in the field who subscribe to this model in one way or another. So essentially, a deficit in some area of phonological processing needs to be exhibited by an individual in order for us to classify them as dyslexia, as having dyslexia. The next model is by Wolf and Bowers, and it is the double deficit hypothesis of dyslexia. So these researchers identified 3 distinct clinical groups in their research. The first one was a group of individuals with that phonological core deficit, which led to impairments in word-level decoding and spelling. The second group displayed naming speed deficits only, and that led to different academic symptoms. They had accurate reading with poor fluency and difficulty retrieving words and math facts. Then there was the double deficit group who had weaknesses in both of those areas, and they exhibited the most severe academic impairments and the worst academic outcomes. So this research was important because, yes.
Could you speak a little louder or closer to the microphone?
Sure. Is this a little bit better? I'll try to speak up. So this research was important because it represented 2 separable sources of reading difficulty. Now, one caveat here is that naming speed deficits, the processes that underlie them, are assessing the phonological loop of working memory. So in some sense, naming speed deficits are under the umbrella of phonological processing, but it's a different skill that needs to be assessed specifically, apart from things like phonemic awareness. This next model comes from Dorothy Bishop and Margaret Snowling, who are researchers in the UK, and they found that there are 2 dimensions of impairment that are important to assess in order to identify 4 distinct groups of readers. So we have phonological processing running on the vertical axis. There's language comprehension running on the horizontal axis. And so if you look at the upper right quadrant, that's the normal reader. They have intact phonology and language comprehension. The upper left quadrant is the poor comprehender. They have intact phonology but impairments in language comprehension. In the lower right is the classic dyslexia profile with impairments in phonology but intact language comprehension. And dyslexia is shown on a continuum of severity. So it goes from mild to severe based on the level of phonological impairment. And then in the lower left quadrant, we have a group of individuals with impairments in both phonological processing and language comprehension. And Bishop and Snowling refers to this group as dyslexia with comprehension impairment. Now, in the framework that I show you next by Virginia Berninger, she describes the same group of individuals, but she uses a different term to describe them. The term that she uses is OWL-LD, or Oral and Written Language Learning Disability. So here's Virginia Berninger's framework in a simplified form. She's differentiating 3 specific learning disabilities that affect reading or writing: dysgraphia, dyslexia, and oral and written language learning disability. She differentiates these learning disabilities by identifying their hallmark level of impairment. So at the top, we find orthographic impairment, and this is at the subword level of language. So orthographic impairments affect our ability to store in memory or retrieve from memory letters and spelling patterns. So individuals with dysgraphia have spelling impairment and severe handwriting impairment. So we see problems with poor letter formation and spacing. Handwriting is very slow and labored. Then going down one level to the dyslexia group, they have impairments in the orthographic and phonological areas of language. They do not show the handwriting impairment that individuals with dysgraphia have, unless the conditions are comorbid. Instead, they have difficulty with spelling. So they have trouble forming orthographic representations of the spellings of words. And with phonology, they struggle to represent the sound structure of language in memory and to decode unfamiliar words. And then at the bottom level, we have the OWL-LD group, and they struggle with morphological and or syntactic levels of language. So this is a word level impairment in addition to a multi-word level impairment. So word level impairments include difficulty with word retrieval, as well as difficulty understanding and using morphology, such as prefixes and suffixes. And their syntactic impairments affect grammar and sentence structure. So the OWL-LD profile affects both oral and written language, both comprehension and expression. And that's distinct from dysgraphia and dyslexia, where oral language remains intact. So just a couple of key takeaways from reviewing these theoretical frameworks. The first one is that a phonological deficit is not the single and universal cause of all reading and spelling difficulties. So those who would defend the single model of dyslexia would say that the phonological deficit is the single and universal cause of the reading and spelling difficulties that we call dyslexia. So it really becomes an issue of classification and where you draw that line with terminology. But we do know that it's important to also assess areas such as naming speed, language comprehension, and orthographic processing. And then we do see inconsistency in the field as far as terminology and classifications go, such as OWL-LD versus dyslexia with poor comprehension. That same group has also been referred to as a specific language impairment. So just keep in mind when we use those terms, we're really referring to the same group. Okay, and I'll turn it back over to Adam to start us off in this next section.
All right, great. Thanks, Christina. So let's talk about some of the steps that we recommend for differential diagnosis. We'll start with this process. I'm going to go through the first two, and then I'm going to ask Christina to go through the last two. So let's start with step one. So it's pretty important that at the first, before we even look at anything, that we analyze the problem and develop a hypothesis. And that really does require us to gather background information. It's invaluable, the information and the data that we get from observation, classroom performance, interviews, and so forth. So when we're thinking about starting this process, remember that if you are in a school system, dyslexia, the dyslexia pathway starts in general education. So we want to be able to see what it is that child is doing, what it is that they are accomplishing or having difficulty with, and we want to see how they're responding to what it looks like for their typical peers or their typically developing peers in the classroom. Also, we want to think about the exclusionary factors and then think about risk factors and onset of difficulty. It seems, at times it seems not practical, but with regard to dyslexia, I will tell you that if we have family history, when we have a student, if you're in a classroom or if you're seeing a child in a clinic, and they have a family history for dyslexia, that's one of the most important risk factors for us to consider, right? So if we have that information beforehand, we know that those children should probably go into a little bit more of a dyslexia-specific diagnostic process than others. So oftentimes I do like to collect that family history earlier rather than later whenever this is a concern. Let's talk about some of the exclusionary factors, and this is important. This is actually a snapshot from the Wyatt-3's Dyslexia Index Score record form, so you can actually see this on there, and it does list all of the exclusionary factors for you so that you can start to think about whether or not it is dyslexia or if we have to start considering other things. So for example, ADHD, attention disorders, they may be comorbid, but that's something you have to consider. You have to consider cultural or linguistic factors. Is the child just learning to speak English, and therefore that's why they're having difficulty reading in English? Stuff like that. Thinking about environmental or economic hardships. Some of the research from even going back to the 70s from researchers by the name of Hart and Risley talk about how different socioeconomic levels, children in homes of parents who have different socioeconomic levels experience or are exposed to different levels of vocabulary than other children right? So there's a variation there, and those children who have lower vocabulary exposure then have difficulty learning to read when they get to school. So those are important exclusionary factors to rule out as well. Instructional factors, so mismatch in type and level of instruction, teachers, those types of things, they're not attending school. Intellectual disability, language disorder, also may be comorbid. Neurogenic disorders or pervasive developmental delays such as autism or epilepsy. We think about physical health factors, social and emotional factors, as well as vision and hearing difficulties. So this is step one. Think about those exclusionary factors in the process. Additionally, like I talked about, assessing for risk factors in the onset of difficulty is super important. And we have some information here on the screen that kind of differentiates between two different very common disorders, oral written language learning disorder and dyslexia. So if they have a history for dyslexia or language impairment, SLI, those children have a 4 to 5 times greater likelihood of dyslexia if they have family history. That's super important for you to remember. That kind of refers back to what I was talking about earlier. And then onset of difficulty, when does that come about? That is a real key difference between the two disorders that are very commonly looked at across from one another. So if the onset of difficulty is in preschool, and the earliest symptoms are late talking, delays in combining words, that's most often associated with oral written language learning disorder. If you have a child whose symptoms are coming on in kindergarten and their difficulties are difficulties with naming, writing letters, associating sounds with letters, that's often associated with a profile of dyslexia. Step 2 would be to collect assessment data and to test the hypothesis. So again, going back to what I showed you before, the framework for symptoms, causes, correlates, and strengths or intact abilities, looking at assessments that can assess for each of those components. Focus on the key skills and abilities that differentiate from similar conditions. I'll talk about that in a minute. Here is an example of a chart. I know this might be kind of difficult to see. I did give you a handout. It is in the handout. You can also find this in a white paper, which we'll give you the reference to in a minute. If you just search Pearson Dyslexia 2017 white paper, you'll find the white paper that has this chart in it. But what it shows you are all of the symptoms, the causes, correlates, risk factors, and possible strengths that we suggest analyzing. And you can see that each of them listed here are the IDA key indicators that I mentioned on the previous slide. So figuring out which sections the child is having difficulty with, whether or not they're low or below average, whether or not they're average or high above average, really thinking about whether or not that causes or has any indication or adds to the incremental variance that I talked about on the earlier slides. So some of the comorbid conditions for dyslexia, it's important to consider. Language and communication disorders, about 50% are comorbid. ADHD, there's between 25 to 40% of students with dyslexia have ADHD. Mental disorders like anxiety, depression, bipolar is about 20%. Dyspraxia, which is a coordination disorder, is about 50%. Dysgraphia, which is a writing disorder, about 40%. And dyscalculia, which is the math disorder, is about 25%. And I think when you analyze things like dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, as well as ADHD really, and learning, really any of these conditions, you start to really analyze and you start to see the pattern that indicates the neurobiological origin, right? So it is important that we consider all of these conditions. So at times you might want to think, is it a dysgraphia versus a dyslexia? It may very well be both. So it's important that you recognize how common this occurs. So if we think about assessments for comorbid conditions, if we're looking at dyspraxia, we look at tests that include or have poor analyze spatial awareness, balance, and coordination. A lot of times we will see this information coming from occupational therapy or physical therapy evaluations using things like the BOT or visual motor assessments and things like that. Dysgraphia, we're looking at now I can't even read the word. Illegible handwriting, poor letter formation and spacing, slow or labored writing. Yes, there are certain writing tests that we can give, certain academic achievement tests that we can see this, but a lot of times these behavioral characteristics can be seen in behavioral observations. So if we go in and see how the child is actually writing in the classroom, this gives us a lot of information about that. Dyscalculia, number concepts, math calculation. Again, we can see it in classroom functioning. We can also see it and through observation and through some academic achievement assessments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it back over to Christina to go over steps 3 and 4.
Great, thanks, Adam. So step 3 of the assessment process is to synthesize and interpret our data. So we're really going to look for patterns. And the patterns begin in the history and background information with the interviews and the observations that we made. And we're going to look through all of the assessment data that we've gathered. It's important to go beyond just the standard scores and conduct error analysis, record behavioral observations during the assessment session. There are so many important insights that can be gained from looking at both the quantitative and the qualitative information that you have. And so then we're going to compare the student's learning profile with the hallmark profiles of reading and writing difficulties. And I have a slide that I'll show you next that sort of summarizes what those are. Then we're going to consider comorbid conditions because, as we've discussed, comorbidity is typically the rule rather than the exception. We'll apply whatever diagnostic criteria is appropriate to our setting. And to the extent that you have influence over the diagnostic criteria or eligibility criteria that you're using, I would encourage you to consider using a hybrid model. And I have a slide that I'll show you on that as well. And then finally, we'll summarize our diagnostic impressions. So this is the work that goes into step 3. So this next slide summarizes the profiles of reading and writing classifications. This is based on a synthesis of the literature, much of which I shared with you earlier. The only one that's not listed here is dysgraphia, which affects the writing space only. So all of the conditions that you see here touch reading specifically, and some of them touch writing as well. So let's go through each of these, starting with dyslexia in the first column. The profile is weaknesses in reading accuracy and fluency, decoding and spelling. Listening comprehension is typically better than reading comprehension. The phonological, the processing weaknesses that we see are either in phonological processing, orthographic processing, rapid automatic naming, working memory, and or processing speed. So we do see variability in the dyslexia profile here, where some individuals have strong phonological core deficits. Others show greater impairment in orthographic processing relative to phonological processing. And then we do see some individuals with the double deficit, like we talked about. So just be aware that you may see some variability in the degree of processing weaknesses. And then they show relative strengths in oral language, cognitive ability, and fluid reasoning. And then going to the OWL-LD profile, we would expect to see weaknesses in oral language, written expression, listening, and reading comprehension, with processing weaknesses in syntax, verbal comprehension, and auditory verbal working memory. They show relative strengths in nonverbal cognitive ability. Then there's the poor comprehender profile with weaknesses in listening and reading comprehension, processing weaknesses in verbal comprehension, and auditory verbal working memory. And they show relative strengths in a lot of areas, most notably word reading and decoding. Then the fluency or naming speed profile that comes out of that double deficit hypothesis shows weaknesses in reading fluency and word retrieval due to a processing weakness in naming speed, and relative strengths in word reading and decoding. And then finally, there's a global profile. It's sometimes referred to as the garden variety poor reader. They show weaknesses in all areas of reading and listening comprehension, and their cognitive abilities are all sort of in the low average range. So they're not low enough to be considered to have an intellectual disability. They do show intact adaptive functioning. But overall, what we see is a very low average and flat academic and cognitive profile for these individuals. So they may not meet certain diagnostic criteria that we have for a specific learning disability, but these students certainly do need academic support. Okay, and we have a question for the group. Adam, did you want to take this slide?
Sure. I just want you to select all that apply here. Which of these profiles have you seen in practice, either in your school or clinical setting? Go ahead and select which ones you've seen based on the profiles that Christina just reviewed. It always makes me chuckle when I see the responses coming through so fast.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some are certainly more prevalent than others.
So you should be seeing the graphs coming up, or the bars coming up, everyone. You can see that the vast majority of us have seen mostly dyslexia, 86%, almost 87%. We see a lot of folks with the poor comprehender and fluency, global, oral and written language, OWL, LD, not necessarily as much, but pretty consistent across most of them. All right, great. And now we do have one more question for you. So what other profiles or combinations of symptoms and difficulties have you seen in practice? There are a number of hot-button topics and descriptors of reading disorder and what those look like. I've had a couple questions come through about surface dyslexia. What does that mean, those types of things. So what have you seen? What do you think comes up in your experience? Wow, we have a lot coming through on the right side there, Christina. So we see a lot of dysgraphia and orthographic processing difficulties, dyslexia with severe visual processing difficulties, orthographic, poor symbol imagery, as defined by Linda Mood Bell. Do you see any up there that you want to call out? I see a lot. Well, thank you guys. There's a lot of results coming through.
Yeah, I'll have to spend some time going through these. Yeah, that's
yeah,
really
wow, there's a lot.
See.
So there is the surface dyslexia, SLD and basic reading that comes up too. Christina, do you want to mention just a little bit about the term of surface dyslexia?
Yeah, so when I presented the hallmark profiles, and I suppose I could go back and show that slide. Yeah, right here. So when we look at that first column of dyslexia, so and I mentioned that there's some variability in processing weaknesses. So if an individual has primarily orthographic processing weaknesses and limited phonological processing weaknesses, so that can be considered orthographic dyslexia or surface dyslexia. Versus, the phonological core deficit, the classic dyslexia profile. So that is one that we do tend to see.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks everybody for participating in those. Some really great information coming from you all, and there's so many of you on the call. I apologize, we can't read all your responses. But okay, go ahead, Christina.
Okay, thanks. So the hybrid model for dyslexia identification was designed to address the problems that we see in the field for high rates of misdiagnosis, a lot of false negatives and children not being identified when they should be, and also that problem of just inconsistent classifications where a student meets the criteria for dyslexia using one set of criteria but not another set of criteria. So in large part this is happening because we're basing our decisions on a single indicator. Maybe it's poor decoding, maybe it's poor phonological awareness, an IQ achievement discrepancy, or poor response to intervention. Whenever we use just a single indicator and we require that it be met, our classification becomes unreliable because there's a cut point reliability problem. So wherever you decide your cut point is for that indicator, you're always going to have students who hover right around it, and they might just fall short of it, but if you test them again next year, then they might cross and go back and forth. So the hybrid model offers a promising solution by combining multiple indicators to improve the reliability of diagnosis or classification. So it does not require any single indicator to be met. Some researchers recommend using criteria of N or more symptoms. So maybe you would say that a student needs to meet 3 or more or 4 or more of the following symptoms in order to be classified as having dyslexia. They also recommend including poor response to intervention as one of those criterion. So if you'd like more information about hybrid models, and if you'd like to see the research citations, you can look up our Pearson Dyslexia Toolkit white paper. If you just put that in your browser, it'll come up as the first thing, and it's a free PDF. So I would encourage you to check that out. So the final step in our evaluation process is to develop our intervention and evaluate it. So we're going to tailor our intervention approach based on the assessment data that we've gathered, and then continually evaluate the intervention. This is definitely a recursive process, so we're going to progress monitor and revise our intervention as we get new information that's learned during the intervention process. So we're following a test, teach, test cycle, and there's a lot more that I could say about exactly how we might go about linking our assessment data to our intervention plan, but I need to be mindful of the time. I will come back to that during the case study. So we can go ahead and transition to the case study. This is one that I borrowed from Harrison and McManus. The research citation is at the bottom of this slide. And they did a really nice job of differentiating between dyslexia, dysgraphia, LLD, a lot of the principles that we've talked about today. So the student is Ethan. He's a 13-year-old in 7th grade. And his primary concern is a persistent difficulty with spelling and writing. His written expression is very limited in output. He has a lot of spelling and grammatical errors, such as omitting words and word endings, and he uses really simple vocabulary in his writing. So the first step in our evaluation process is to analyze the problem and develop hypotheses. So we're going to be developing hypotheses as we go and learn more about Ethan's case. So from the history and background interviews, we learned that Ethan lives with both parents and 2 younger sisters. He has strong family relations. Only English is spoken at home, and he presents with normal medical and developmental history, normal vision and hearing. Academically, math is a relative strength for him, but he says he hates writing, he avoids it at all costs, and he prefers speaking his ideas. He says that he considers himself to be fine at reading, but he prefers audiobooks because his eyes get tired. So that's a bit of a red flag, and we would want to investigate a possible reading concern. In the area of social emotional development, Ethan is socially competent. He has age-appropriate peer relations and extracurricular pursuits. However, Ethan's father is concerned about Ethan's self-esteem. He reports disliking school and has even expressed a desire to drop out. His teachers believe that his academic struggles are taking an emotional toll. So now we're concerned about elevated stress, low self-esteem, and the possibility of anxiety or depression. So we would go through the exclusionary factors for dyslexia, and the only one that we do see some evidence for is possible social and emotional concerns. There are no diagnoses, but there are some areas that we would want to explore further. So we look at first our risk factors for dyslexia. Ethan has not taken any dyslexia screeners, but he does have a positive family history for dyslexia on his dad's side. However, he does not have any history of preschool language impairment or delay. So the onset of difficulty is in the kindergarten to grade 3 space. He did have some problems learning to read, and school records indicated that he was a slow reader and had difficulty comprehending text or written instructions. So based on this, the hypothesis so far looks more like dyslexia or a similar reading-writing disorder. The onset of difficulty does not support LLD, but we would definitely want to confirm his language skills in the assessment process. So now it's time to collect assessment data to test our hypotheses. So based on cognitive assessment, we do not have concerns about his overall cognitive ability. He did just fine. However, he exhibited several areas of processing weakness, including phonology orthography, naming speed, auditory verbal working memory, and processing speed. His verbal comprehension ability was intact. And so intact verbal comprehension does not support the OLLD profile. So what we see here so far is consistent, again, with dyslexia. And then his academic assessment showed very poor spelling, written expression, and writing fluency. So his writing was very slow. He omitted words and word endings and had very poor written mechanics. However, his handwriting was legible with adequate spacing and letter formation. Then when we look at his reading skills, we see poor decoding, word reading fluency, and reading comprehension. His reading comprehension was below his listening comprehension skills. And then he did show relative strengths in math with no issues writing or aligning his numerals. So again, this so far is looking really consistent with the dyslexia profile. So now it's time to start synthesizing and interpreting our data. And if we compare Ethan's learning profile to those hallmark reading and writing difficulties that we went over earlier, we can begin to rule out a lot of those other profiles. So Ethan shows intact cognitive ability and fluid reasoning. So that rules out the garden variety poor reader profile. He shows intact oral language comprehension, expression, and grammar. So that rules out OLLD. So the grammar skills that Ethan needs to work on are specific to written language. And then his relative strengths with math rule out dyscalculia. And his handwriting is adequate. So that rules out dysgraphia. He shows academic weaknesses in word level decoding and spelling. So that rules out the poor comprehender profile as well as the fluency naming speed profile, because both of those typically show intact decoding and spelling skills. And then finally, Ethan's social emotional functioning was measured by the BASC-2, and the results showed elevated ratings for anxiety across all raters, and he was at risk for a sense of inadequacy. So now it's time to summarize our diagnostic impressions. So Ethan's profile supports a diagnosis of dyslexia. This is consistent with his early difficulty acquiring reading skills, although his reading impairment has gone undetected. This might be partly due to his strong compensatory strategies in reading. He shows elevated symptoms of anxiety at home and at school, suggesting a secondary social emotional impact of his learning difficulties. So he does meet DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for specific learning disability with moderate impairment in reading as well as written expression. So the final step would be to plan an intervention approach for Ethan. And the initial intervention recommendations were focused only in the area of writing, and that was the primary presenting concern. So there may be some secondary goals that could be written to support his reading and certainly his emotional concerns, but at least initially the focus was on writing. So the goals were to improve his self-efficacy and motivation for writing, his knowledge and skills in both the process and products of writing. We want to improve his lower level transcription skills as well as his higher level clarity and organizational skills and overall productivity. So the program that was selected was the Self-Regulated Strategy Development Model, or SRSD. And there's a lot of good research support for this intervention approach. If you're interested in it, you can search Project Write and Vanderbilt University. So I've never used it before, and I don't have any financial interest or ties to the program. I just thought you might be interested if you want to look it up. That's where you'll find it. And it offers a systematic and collaborative intervention approach the students develop and apply positive self-statements about writing, and they do work on all genres of written expression. So the researchers included frequent progress monitoring probes to monitor and adjust the instruction. So a couple of key takeaways that I would underscore from this case study would be to just remember that dyslexia is as much a writing disorder as it is a reading disorder. We know that spelling is the most persistent impairment, and so it's really important to address these areas when planning an intervention approach for an individual with dyslexia. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Adam for review and wrap up.
All right, great. Thanks, Christina. I think that case was really compelling, and we got a lot of questions coming through about Ethan. Ethan was 13. I did see a question that just came through about that again. So as a review and wrap up, what I'd like to do is just make sure that we go over some of the learning objectives. So just to make sure that you all, we all met your expectations for this course. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Go ahead and put in your answers to this. So we're going to review this. List the constructs that differentiate between dyslexia and related disorders, or the most common constructs that we can use in assessment to differentiate between dyslexia and related disorders. Go ahead and put your answers in there. What specific assessment constructs would you use to do that? Awesome. So I see spelling coming through, rapid automatic naming, phonology, working memory, phonological processing, all of which are very good. Absolutely. Any other comments on that, Christina?
Yeah, I'm glad to see that listening comprehension is better than reading comprehension. So that's a hallmark characteristic of dyslexia. I'm glad to see that as well.
I see several tests, people putting several tests in there, and what I want to caution against is just saying that a test will do this for you. It won't. No test will just do it all for you that way, and my suggestion in this situation is to think about the key areas and think about what subtests or what tests are measuring those. It may be that you can get most of those areas measured through one assessment. It may be the case that you can determine dyslexia based on the profile you find. But in any time we are looking to differentiate between diagnoses and really do that differential diagnosis part of our discussion, it's important that you don't just rely on one assessment over another. I think there are many out there that can assess for those. Good job, everybody. You got some really good information in here. Awesome. Next one. Well, we have only a minute left, but I'll have some really important information that I'm going to end with, so please don't leave until I give you that information. The next one is list the combo of symptoms and correlates that distinctly identify dyslexia. What are some combinations that we should be looking for? What should we be thinking about here that we should identify together? Symptoms and correlates. So I'll give you an example. We're looking for a poor word reading, and we're looking for deficits in phonological processing. That's just one example. Oh, wow, there's a lot that just came through very quickly. I love when that happens. All of a sudden now I have to process. I have to read very, very quickly. Yeah, low fluency, low phonology, things like that. Difficulty decoding, reading, and spelling, poor spelling and decoding. Reading accuracy, poor decoding, spelling. Family history, that's good too because that brings in the risk factors. Awesome. Good job, everyone. Thank you for those responses. I'll give you just one more quick second because you guys are putting those in there very fast. Okay. And now let's go to the next one, which is list 3 disorders that often co-occur with dyslexia. And that's the last learning outcome that I want to make sure that you can do. What are 3 common disorders in that we look at with dyslexia that co-occur, comorbidity? ADHD, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, language disorders, anxiety. Awesome, everybody. You have a lot going on here. Oral, written language learning disorders, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. Awesome. Yeah, you guys are getting some good ones in there. Good job. Really great. I'm glad you guys all listened in today. I'm going to leave this up for one quick second. Because we are, Christina and I are employees of Pearson, the idea of this professional development session was to expand knowledge around differential diagnosis. But we also do have something, a little something cool for you all to look at. Until the end of the year, we actually have for U.S. customers a very exciting offer. So for attending today, you have the ability to go and receive these two offers, which is that if you order anything that is fairly new, which means if you're looking at any of the assessments that are new, like the KABC-2NU, the PPVT-5 EBT3, the RAT-5, the WISC-5 Spanish, Ravens, GFTA-3 Spanish, VLT3, or the Brown Executive Functioning, or the ESI-3, any of the new tests that have been just recently released in the past 2 years, you will, if you order now, you do get free Q Global scoring for a full year, and you also get free shipping on your entire order. So, please feel free to take advantage of that. It's all listed here. You can call the customer service number. It is phone orders only. So we're really just pleased to offer you that for the end of the year, 2018. So again, until December 31st, you have that ability. We've had a really great time today. I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Christina Bro, and our host, Sherry Locken, for helping us out today. I really hope you all enjoyed our session, and look for us again on our next go-around. Have a great day, everybody, and I'll close it out by just showing you some of our contact information if you have any additional questions. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you, everyone.